Hello, and welcome to today's Mapchats webinar of the people, for the people, using data tools for good government. I'm Bernie Langer, and I'm a senior data analyst at PolicyMap. PolicyMap, the organization behind this webinar series, is a national online mapping service that provides maps and data visualization tools for tens of thousands of indicators related to housing, health, demographics, and more. We'll talk a little bit about PolicyMap at the very end of the webinar. And we're also very proud to be co-presenting this webinar with NDC, and Raquel Favela from NDC will be talking a little bit more about that when she's presenting. Mapchats is a free webinar series that we offer that features experts from a variety of topics, including housing policy, community and economic development, healthy food access, placemaking, and other really interesting topics. Our speakers discuss how their work incorporates data and mapping, and if you find this webinar to be interesting, we have recordings of all of our previous ones on our website. Today, we'll be hearing from three people who work in and with governments to make them more effective through data. Raquel Favela from NDC, Bryce Moretsky from the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, and Steve Barlow from NPI Memphis. The first presenter is Raquel Favela, the Director of Strategic Planning and Policy Solutions at NDC. Raquel has been a community developer since 1994. In 2007, Raquel delivered San Antonio its first strategic community development plan, informed by a data framework known as a market value analysis. Her next role was with National Development Council, NDC, advising clients all over the country on financing structures for challenging redevelopment projects. In 2017, Raquel served the city of Dallas as Chief of Economic Development and Neighborhood Services. Among her many accomplishments, she delivered the city's first comprehensive housing policy, addressed longstanding local and federal audit findings, and led the city's major corporate recruitment efforts, including the highly competitive Amazon HQ2. I'll turn it over to Raquel.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Just a tiny bit about the National Development Council, because we're really proud to be celebrating our 50-year anniversary working in community development. We're a national nonprofit organization. We are a technical assistance provider. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's nonprofit lingo for a consultant-like service. And we are also very much known for our curriculum. We are trainers in housing and economic development professional certification. And then third, we actually help client communities with structuring financing of transactions through our Housing and Economic Development Corporation. So we are a community development financial institution like our partners over at the Reinvestment Fund. And so we find ourselves partnering very often in several engagements. And when we are providing technical assistance in a community like Dallas, like San Antonio, and like smaller communities around those cities, we always feel the need to tell them about our partner nonprofit organizations, because we think there's great value because they build capacity just in the same way that NDC does. And so I'm real happy to tell you a little bit about my experience in Dallas, because I think that there are a lot of lessons and takeaways, both from the 50, 60-year history of some what not to do, and then some lessons on how you can begin to dig out of some of those issues over time. And so we can get started on sort of what was the impetus in Dallas for this data framework. And first, I'll tell you that Dallas has had not just a history with its federal programs, but also with some of its local tools. There are tax increment financing tools, in Texas, something called a Chapter 380 grant, all around economic development to encourage housing and small business expansion, corporate recruitment efforts. And there were several Supreme Court cases and several audits that sort of found the city of Dallas to not be in compliance. And in fact, some of its related agencies like the Housing Authority and its Housing Finance Corporation to have policies that were in fact creating a disparate impact in their in the way that they implemented those policies. In fact, so much so that the areas called recap areas, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, increased in Dallas from about 7% to about a little over 12% in a 10-year span. So 12% of their census tracts were now recap areas. So obviously, the strategies that they were implementing were not reducing areas of poverty. They were, in fact, increasing them. Again, compounded by the fact that they were being audited not just by HUD, other federal agencies, local auditors and third-party entities. And in addition to some of the administrative noncompliance, there were some noncompliance issues related to the lack of implementation of affirmatively furthering fair housing. When you combine that with some of the market conditions that changed between 2007 and 2017, there was a lack of housing unit construction in what would be considered the affordable housing price range, which would have been anything under the $299,999 range. And so anything below that was sort of almost non-existent, such that in 2017, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas held a housing summit, and we learned that there was an annual shortage in the metro area of about 20,000 units for that metro area. So based on population growth and then based on just loss of housing units. And all of this time, the city essentially lacked a comprehensive housing policy. They didn't really have any standard and transparent way to evaluate projects. And so it was very well known that there was, sort of an ad hoc process for securing funding. So for those of you who work in local government, you know that that is an environment for chaos and sometimes corruption. In addition to that, there were some capacity issues, right? We didn't have capacity at the staff level, didn't have capacity in the nonprofit level to the extent that the city needed in order to produce 20,000 units. So we had to look externally to other partners. And part of the issue was there weren't a whole lot of partners interested in partnering with the city in that kind of environment. Because of the lack of a strategic plan, they really were looking for the city to sort of pull it together. And so we entered into this relationship with the reinvestment fund to develop a market value analysis for the city of Dallas. And we, through a local steering committee, came to an agreement on the data points that would be relevant to Dallas on figuring out what markets were strong, what were the middle markets, and then which were the markets where there was some level of distress. And so what you see here are a representation of those variables. So I won't go into a whole lot of detail on these, but I will point out that this was an incredible tool to dispel some long-standing myths in the market. One of those, for example, was that a high rental market automatically meant that a real estate market would be weakened. And so we were able to show that in market type C, one of their top tier markets, the ownership rate was only 31%. So that it's not on its own an indicator of market strength in a community. On the other hand, you can see where the ownership rate in one of the very distressed markets, market type H, 60% home ownership, didn't necessarily translate into market strength. So this was an incredibly useful tool. Also, the second point I will make on this was that we knew that we had a concentration of publicly subsidized housing in some areas. But this tool was able to help us see that in market type G, 63% on average was a publicly subsidized household. That would include either Section 8, a public housing unit, any tax credit unit, or any multifamily unit that the city of Dallas had subsidized. And so, you know, once you put the model together in GIS, you end up with this kind of map that is a great visual representation. Once we were ready to go out to the community and talk to folks, we were no longer having a dialogue about what people's perceptions were about the market, but in fact, what they were on the ground. And so that was very helpful because, you know, when I first got to Dallas, you would have thought there were only two market types in Dallas, north and south, and they were all, you know, just two different types of market. And so this helped to establish that, in fact, Southern Dallas had middle markets and pockets of strength from which we could draw and build something. And that also in North Dallas, there were pockets of distress that were surrounded by incredibly strong markets that made the naturally affordable housing that existed there be very vulnerable and susceptible to investors coming in, buying it out, turning it into luxury apartments, and losing that affordability. So it helped us devise strategies for addressing that. The next part of it involved a community engagement process that was pretty comprehensive and I think innovative, because the other thing I heard from folks was we have meeting fatigue. There are way too many community meetings for us to go to, including some of the key stakeholders. So we did not just in-person town hall meetings, but virtual telephone town hall meetings. And so we had over 38,000 participants in those. So we had, developers, we had lenders, philanthropic organizations, and the community at large able to participate in the town halls. And it was sort of a mutual exchange and learning experience around specific topics that led us to, in an informed way, now we know what the market is like. Now let's all learn about how residential real estate gets financed in the open and competitive market. What is driving development costs in Dallas? And then what are some capital resources that we should be attracting that we aren't currently using? And then together, let's figure out some programs, policies, and new solutions to addressing this housing problem. And that, it proved to be a good way to get good feedback. We also found that the virtual telephone town hall was less, it made people feel more comfortable talking about their specific housing issue without feeling like they were going to be personally threatened by someone because they were in some way vulnerable and needed housing assistance. So those in-person meetings tended to put people in the we don't want you in our neighborhood and the we need housing help. So as we were developing and receiving recommendations, we posted everything live on the website. So it was a very transparent process. There were several groups, external groups that prepared entire policy recommendations to the housing policy. And so in the end, we provided the council an in-depth briefing memo on which ones we recommended as a short term. Yes, we can do this today. Medium term, we should do this soon. And then long term, we probably need to change some legislation. So we had sort of a three-prong approach. You'll see if you visit our model that's online for the MDA that there are 3 reinvestment strategy areas. It just sort of helped the city focus and drive development into some key areas and the type of development that the city would encourage. So in a redevelopment area, those are areas that are middle markets where development we knew could happen within 12 to 18 months. Stabilization areas where people were already getting displaced either because of the natural market situation or because of city investments, and then emerging markets where the city frankly needed to make some infrastructure improvements, some environmental enhancements like code, vacant lot, and then some actual land banking to prepare the area for actual real estate investment. So basically the priorities became the preservation of existing affordable housing stock, the construction of new housing opportunities in middle markets, and then stabilizing areas where there was already some displacement occurring. So we came up with several new policies and programs and tools that Dallas had not had. For some reason, because for a long period of time, the focus was encouraging home ownership, there was, for example, no rental rehab program. So this policy instituted a new rental rehab program. We also maxed out all the caps on any home repair assistance, not just for homeowner rental rehab, but also for rental repair programs. Also expanded the home buyer assistance program so that it matched the market situation. So unfortunately, they had a cap of $20,000 maximum if you were buying from a Chodo, or $12,000 if you were buying in the open market. Well, a policy like that actually forces a low-income person to buy in a distressed community where Chodos were working, as opposed to opening market opportunities for a low-income person to buy anywhere in the city. And the delta between what a low to moderate income person could afford in Dallas and the median sales price of a home in Dallas was way deeper than $20,000. So that cap was completely disconnected from those market realities. We also identified that a big reason for why there was not any development or rehab occurring in some of the areas in southern Dallas was because people didn't own clear title to their property. There was no will left, and so there was a cloudy title. So we established a program to help do that. And then again, think more strategically through how and where to land bank properties so that they could achieve the policy goals and the production goals. And then some longer term things included where the development code needed to be revised, where does it make sense to allow for accessory dwelling units, what kind of inclusionary zoning in Texas, we have to call it incentive zoning, but where can that be allowed to encourage additional housing, which is non-financial contribution that the city can make to encourage additional unit construction. And then as it relates to displacement mitigation, neighborhood empowerment zones in Texas allow a municipality to provide property tax freezes. Where did it make sense to establish neighborhood empowerment zones? Stabilization areas were some of those areas where we recommended the designation of those zones. We also established a new housing trust fund, and then also helped them identify the funding source. How do you seed that based on the existing tax increment finance districts? We also established a non-contiguous MDA TIF district to help increase funding that's available to the housing production goals. And then we created in that policy a new process for soliciting projects. So it sets out the NOFA structure for soliciting those projects and tells the potential respondents what the scoring criteria is. So there's no mystery to it. They can, if they're in those target areas, they get bonus points, but they can still be very competitive if they're outside of those target areas, as long as they meet positive neighborhood characteristic goals. So this gives a new process also for evaluating low-income housing tax credits, so the city no longer is concentrating all of the tax credits the way that it was in certain council districts. So some of the takeaways from that experience included, making sure that everybody understood the housing market and a process to have a real intensive process on how to understand that housing market, and the market value analysis is extremely helpful in accomplishing that. And then also to set specific production goals for all the programs so that you can manage expectations. I remember sitting down at one of those town hall meetings and asking the development community, the shortage is 20,000 units a year. Is that something that you all think we can meet? And the resounding answer was no. We may be able to meet that over 3 years, but we just cannot do that. And we got into several discussions that led to why? Well, we have a labor shortage. We have these other issues that we need to partner on and work on, which led to, discussions about workforce solutions. So there were a lot of other discussions that came out of this that were more long-term. And then I guess the other takeaway is, of course, you have to go into a process like this understanding that there will absolutely be resistance to change, and that it will be very strong resistance to the change. There's a lot of comfort in doing the same thing because it's what we know, even if the results we've gotten have not been what we want. There's comfort in repeating the same practice. And then that sometimes as we set up organizations like Chodos or like nonprofits, carving out geographies ends up building sort of power structures that then focus on just securing funding as opposed to meeting the actual goal, which is we need to build housing. And so in Dallas, the priority became funding organizations instead of actual unit production. And then really that there has to be a consistent method by which we can make and demystify these federal funding sources, because it's not common knowledge how the Community Development Block Grant Program works or how Home Investment Partnership works. And it is the municipality's role to help build an understanding and a local capacity on how they work, so that there's an understanding of why we cannot only serve families at 30% of AMI, for example. What are the rules for city funding versus housing authority funding? So I will either pause I forgot to ask you if we're pausing for questions after each, or we're walking through all.
We're going to go through all of them and do questions at the end. So thank you so much. That was a really great presentation, and I think really touched on how data can be used to really understand communities, dispel myths, engage with the community, and really evaluate how your programs and practices are going. So without further ado, I'm going to move to our next presenter, Bryce Moretsky, who was appointed in 2013 to be Director of Policy and Planning for the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, where he leads all the agency's long-range planning and directs a number of policy initiatives. He also supervises the implementation of the Office of Financial Education that was transferred to PHFA from the Department of Banking. Before PHFA, Bryce was with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development as Deputy Secretary for Administration and Director of Legislative Affairs, after starting in 2004 as Director of Policy. He created a complete revision of the silos attached to economic and community development to create a coordinated, comprehensive approach to rebuild and revitalize Pennsylvania communities. So Bryce, take it away.
Thank you, Bernie. I appreciate it. And Rachel, your presentation was terrific, and I'd like to sort of try and take that up to sort of a statewide level, and in Pennsylvania, sort of what we're trying to do, and the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency is the statewide agency that is designated as the tax credit allocatee for about $30 million a year of tax credits. We also service loans, about 60,000 loans that we service. We fund housing counseling activities. We do first-time home buyer activities. We manage the State Housing Trust Fund. So we do a variety of housing and broader community development activities across the entire Commonwealth. And many of you know that if you're in Pennsylvania, we have the large urban centers of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and some smaller urban centers around Harrisburg and State College and Erie and Allentown and Scranton, and then a lot of very rural communities across Pennsylvania. And so when we, as the statewide housing agency, we're oftentimes trying to figure out how do we look at data and use data to think about the differences that need to exist in the programs and allow for enough flexibility in the programs that can address a variety of needs. And so what we've figured out is that we've now been able to merge both data collection, data management, as well as data mining based on the needs of our customers. And, those customers include community development corporations, local CDCs, human service organizations, for-profit developers, nonprofit developers, 67 county governments, several over 1,000 local governments and school districts and things like that. So lots of different customers and stakeholders that are all involved in thinking about housing activities. And so what we do is now try and, through the application process, we try and draw out what are some of the local needs, what are the local gaps and unmet needs that we can then fund with the resources. We know we don't have enough resources to do everything. And so how do we make priorities, and how do we really then address the most critical local needs? And so the applications that come in give us that insight. And we ask very clearly as a part of the application process, tell us about those unmet needs. Give us data that documents where those unmet needs are and how you're going to prioritize the particular projects or programs to meet those needs. And then we can analyze that information and roll it up and look at it across the entire Commonwealth. And it really has helped us be much more strategic about our investment approach. We also then layer the local information and the applicant-driven information with other sources, community survey, HUD data, census data, and other data sources that we pull to really get a deeper understanding of community need. So you can see this chart shows you across Pennsylvania percentage of renters paying more than 30% of the household income. These are the kinds of charts and graphics that we can produce for ourselves, right? We use, to help think about, as we're reviewing applications, where, in Monroe County, which is a fairly rural county in, the northeast of Pennsylvania, 48% of the households pay more than 30% of their rent. What do we think is going on there? How do we help address some of those needs? And how do we use the tools that we have to address those needs? Which may be different than in Philadelphia, where a very urban community, where for almost 50% of the renters are paying more than 30%. But the housing supply and demand looks very different in Monroe County versus Philadelphia County. So we are continually assessing the information that's coming into us, as well as external information. We are getting ongoing reporting from our grantees and awardees about what they're doing and what the projects and programs are doing, which then we use in this constant feedback loop to help us look forward to the next year's rounds of whether it's a tax credit or a state housing trust fund program, what's that reporting telling us about what we should be focusing on as priorities in the next round? We use mapping tools to help us sort of look across all 67 counties and see what kinds of issues, what may be popping out to us that may need to be addressed in the short term or in the longer term. And we're really trying to use our applications and our resources to really create much better outcomes and not move from sort of the output piece to really outcomes. And so in the tax credit allocation plan, the qualified action plan for the year that we put out for our tax credits, we ask developers and applicants to think about sort of where are they locating their developments? How are those developments impacting the community? And how is the community impacting those developments? And so it's not just a matter of we're producing 3,000 more units of affordable rental housing across the Commonwealth, but how's that resulting in stronger communities in places where there really is need, and that as Rachel talked about earlier, that we're not continuing to just concentrate housing in places where it's always been, and there's no more reason to sort of continue to make those concentrations. We have about every 10 years, we actually do our own sort of comprehensive plan and put out an RFP. The last one was done in 2008. And we have just received applications for our newest comprehensive housing study, which really will be a complete look at a very detailed set of housing needs, supply, demand, demographics across the Commonwealth. And then we have actually, in the RFP, we received a number of special topics for in-depth analysis that included things like looking at the issues around supportive housing for persons with disability, looking at differences between what are the differences in housing needs in urban places versus more rural places. What has the changes in the economic conditions in a county or in a community meant in terms of changes in the housing market? What has gentrification, what is it doing to the housing community, and how is it impacting our community development efforts? What are the disparities in home ownership among minority populations? How's that resulting in changing needs for housing and program tools? How has changing weather patterns impacted housing and housing markets? And so there's about 17 different sort of sub-area in-depth analyses that we're looking to fund as a part of the comprehensive study. And so again, we'll be sharing all that information, and we hope that once we're done with those studies, we will have a lot more information out in the community for users to help guide application submission, local planning efforts, and local development. So again, we use data from a variety of sources to measure both progress and impact of the programs and the projects and the programs that and the efforts that we put our dollars into. We are doing more and more sort of ongoing monitoring, both of a program on the programmatic sort of outputs and outcomes, as well as fiscally. Are you using the money the way you're supposed to? As down later, I talk about, we have public resources and we are the stewards of those public resources. And so we need to communicate to state legislature, to the governor's office, to our own board of directors, to outsiders and advocates about how the dollars are being used and how the impact is being driven based on those dollars. And so we have to sort of we're reactive in getting information and trying to be more and more proactive in using that information. And we think that by having, again, this sort of continuous feedback loop, ultimately we'll get better practitioners who are using that information to make better public policy decisions and better project decisions. There are a number of, we see a number of barriers to data capture, but they begin to, initially it was sort of cost and creating IT systems for data capture and data manipulation and data maintenance. But those have continued to drop. And as they continue to drop, we continue to make investments in them. And we think it results in better accountability and better transparency. And places like PolicyMap have been terrific partners in being able to work with us and others in terms of bringing those barriers down for a statewide agency and for local communities to use data better in their decision. And ultimately, we have to sort of move beyond this sort of garbage in, garbage out, and get to this just-in-time kind of information where we're continually getting information from applicants, from projects, from programs, and spitting it back out in usable sort of ways so that we can understand how the dollars are being spent, what the impact is, and that we're maximizing the impact. So and again, I'm happy to take questions at the end, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
So thank you, Bryce. That was another really great presentation. So let me introduce Steve Barlow, our final presenter. Steve Barlow is president of Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. and staff attorney for the city of Memphis. Steve has been involved in community organizing, legislative advocacy, and community development efforts in Memphis since 1995 and has led efforts for the past 8 years to use civil rights litigation in the Shelby County Environmental Court to enforce blight reduction and hold negligent property owners accountable. He founded Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. in 2011 to help remove the systemic barriers to revitalizing Memphis neighborhoods. Its flagship program is the Blight Elimination Steering Team, a cross-agency collaboration where more than 30 organizations from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors meet monthly to collaborate on responding to vacancy and abandoned property issues. The Blight Elimination Steering Team created the Memphis Property Hub in 2015 as a community data portal for neighborhood and community leaders to become equipped with the data they need to preserve and revitalize their neighborhoods. So Steve, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here today and with the esteemed panelists who have already spoken. We had somebody who talked a lot about local government acting as local government in Raquel, and then state government in Bryce. And the organization that I work for now, that was founded in 2011, Neighborhood Preservation Incorporated, is a private nonprofit, and we see ourselves as the come alongside government to help in policy and in innovation. This is the sort of the brief outline of what I would like to cover in my brief comments. Tell you about my organization, tell you about the Memphis Property Hub, which lives on PolicyMap. So we log into PolicyMap and look at the local Memphis version, and talk about how this Property Hub project and the team building that went into that helps local and state government. We as an organization are all about neighborhood revitalization with a real focus on blighted properties, vacancy and abandonment, neglect of real estate. And we collaborate with a lot of local partners, some government, some foundations, some nonprofit, many neighborhood associations and community development groups to collaborate. We're first and foremost a collaborative organization. And we're working on systems. We're trying to get to the systems level of the cause of widespread neglect of real estate in our community. We realized early in our work that we didn't know the face of the enemy, which is these blighted properties. How many, where, who owns them, what's going on with code, what's going on with tax delinquency. what types of transfers are occurring, who are the owners, where are the owners' addresses. Those types of things became very clear in our early days. The NPI in the middle of this chart shows you sort of where we see the overlap. There's a revitalization effort of many organizations that we overlap with. There's a goal of just reducing the sheer number of blighted properties that we overlap with, and then there's the health of economically distressed neighborhoods goal of many of our partner agencies, and we see ourselves as sort of right in the middle of those efforts. The three things that we do as an organization are we advocate for policy and legislative change, usually at the state and local level, although we anticipate at some point in the future getting involved at the federal level, particularly in the housing policy arena. We work on building and sustaining a community-wide effort. That's the Blight Elimination Steering Team mentioned in my introduction. The Blight Elimination Steering Team is how we collaborate. We have monthly meetings of everybody who cares about this particular issue of vacancy and abandonment in our community, whether they work for the government or the state or a nonprofit or private sector or the Chamber of Commerce. And we talk about what's going on, and we work on an action plan that we have developed collaboratively. And then the third box you see is the neighborhood innovation box. And to me, that's the most exciting. That's sort of my roots. Before I even went to law school, I was a neighborhood community development activist, and I love being in the neighborhoods and working on projects that matter to neighbors. But one of the things I know from that work is that the neighbors always want to know a certain list of questions, like maybe 10 things. And those 10 things change. The answer to those 10 questions frequently changes based upon transfers of real estate, code enforcement activity, tax foreclosure activity. And so one of the things I'm proud to say that we can generate out of our property hub now is that data report that every neighborhood group I've ever worked with wants to know, and we can generate maps and charts and update it with real-time data. The property hub started in 2015. We visited Cleveland and we talked with the Cuyahoga Land Bank in Cleveland about how they kept up with data in their Neo-Can-Do system. And we shamelessly and with their full consent stole their data portal, their property data portal. And since then, we've been through another entire iteration in partnership and in collaboration with PolicyMap. And we're actually moving into a third phase at this point. We've come to a new level. The partners who brought together this property hub were the University of Memphis. There's a Center for Applied Engineering and Research, and then there's the Innovate Memphis nonprofit organization, which is one of those Bloomberg innovation teams that you may have heard about from around the country, and then Neighborhood Preservation Inc. So three partners. Each of us took a different role. University of Memphis had the bandwidth, literally, to do massive amounts of data. Innovate Memphis had what it took to leverage local government data, because Innovate Memphis, those Bloomberg teams tend to be very close to City Hall. And so our Innovate Memphis team, one of the things they developed was an Office of Performance Management in City Hall, which got Memphis into the swing of thinking about key performance indicators and true measurable approaches to almost every city program. And then NPI was this. We considered ourselves the salesperson for the product. We tell people why they need it, and then we teach them how to use it, and then we keep them interested, and then keep the product current. It's an open data portal with more than 15 sources. As I mentioned, we came together with PolicyMap, and it's been a great partnership. And we are coming alongside government in many cases to expand their access to tools. Currently, the environmental court, which handles all housing cases in our community, uses the data portal. The tax collector's office uses the data portal. The code enforcement office uses the data portal, and we sort of envision a future where this data portal is really more vertically integrated into city and county government. the theme is supposed to be about, using data tools for good government. So how does this Property Hub tool lead to good government? I guess I touched that too many times. Sorry about that. It helps local government in sort of an output way by, getting employees in those various offices I mentioned engaged in an interactive data environment on a regular basis in their day-to-day work. Data-driven decision making is exactly why I care about this for the blighted property issue. We do regular trainings, we provide hands-on technical assistance, and I should say that we have a really strong Master's of Public Administration a degree a guy by the name of Austin Harrison, who has really led the charge on this technical assistance and the salesmanship. He's been an incredible resource, and if anybody has questions about how to do this on a day-to-day basis, we have somebody who for the last 2 years has been 100% committed to this effort in Memphis, in Austin Harrison. How does it help local government in terms of an outcomes? This creates a space for in between and then across the boundaries of government, helps bridge the gap between the community and the local government, and then it puts the government in a position to respond to opportunities that are data driven. We have an incredible opportunity that just recently came up. If we did not have the Property Hub in place, we never would have been able to do it, because we wouldn't have had the answers to the basic questions that an international data intermediary had of us. Same for smaller opportunities. Ways to bring people together around data. We know the answer to the question so that we can get quickly to the problem solving component and not the data gathering elements. So that was my presentation, and this is how to reach me. I'm handing it back over.
All right, thanks, Steve. Again, another really great presentation. So I'm gonna go right to the questions from the audience with the time that we have left. And if you have any questions that you haven't asked yet, just go into the GoToWebinar interface and type them in, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them. So first question we have here for Bryce. This is from Robert Davis. He asks, in collecting data from local CDCs, how do you help them enter their data with GIS tools so the PHFA staff doesn't need to spend time converting local CDC's data into understandable GIS?
That's a great question. So we have moved. Our State Housing Trust Fund is now an online application. We are sort of trying to figure out a way to capture data that's put in the application and get it into an access Excel spreadsheet that we can then share back out sort of with local groups so that they can use the information. We have our own sort of GIS person in-house who does some of that, but we would love to test pilot with a local CDC, if there's one out there in Pennsylvania that's on this call. I would love to try and figure out how we could sort of do a little test case with working with one CDC or maybe just a couple of CDCs to see how we could really implement something that's much more useful for them, and maybe have PolicyMap involved from their data mapping side as well. So it's something I would love to explore a little bit more.
Great, thank you. I have a question here from Eduardo Porben. This is for Raquel. He says, awesome presentation. When was the NDC established?
NDC was established in 1968, incorporated in 1969.
And is there any, I guess the question is also sort of how sort of what prompted its creation?
So interestingly, what happened is that there was an administration at the federal level, Robert Kennedy's administrative staff, who heard a lot of complaints and requests from municipalities on the resources necessary to help deal with some of the disinvested areas. And so what was very clear, though, was that the type of training that local government employees get in a, for example, public administration curriculum really doesn't give you the tools and the skill set to do community development work, especially back then. And so they put together a nonprofit organization to help local units of government that could advise in the same way that private sector consultants can advise a developer group. So our goal is really to build the capacity of local units of government. So our clients are strictly municipalities, housing authorities, the federal government. We do a lot of work for HUD so that we can help bridge the knowledge gap between the real estate development process, the small business process, and local government.
Great, thank you. And here's a question for Steve. This is from Carol Ann Young. Do you have any examples of bringing together housing and school policy, and what were the barriers and assets of working together?
Let me think for a minute. We certainly have the school real estate department represented on all of our collaborative agency efforts. There's one pretty interesting example of an activation of a long vacant high school in a very important historical, primarily African American neighborhood in Memphis, where there was a community, the city's Division of Housing and Community Development, with community partners put together an activation at an abandoned school in the hopes that this school could somehow develop a use. There's another example in South Memphis as a part of our Choice Neighborhoods program in South City in Memphis, Tennessee, where the demolition of a school is likely to result in some use for sports fields. So there certainly is a inter and intra-governmental conversation about the abandoned, unutilized, I shouldn't say abandoned, but the unutilized school buildings that don't have a easily foreseeable future use. That is a challenge in every community I know when we have sort of a changing approach to how we do schools. Not so much the neighborhood schools, but the big sort of multi-use schools that are multi-neighborhood. We've got to figure out what do we do with those buildings, those massive buildings on massive pieces of land. And in a city like Memphis that is sprawled and relatively sparse, it's easy to ignore it until it becomes a big problem. So I would say that just creative partnerships with neighborhood involvement and with the city being an active partner and the school leadership being actively involved is the secret to a successful collaboration in that area. But we certainly haven't solved that challenge here. We're certainly whittling away at it in a collaborative way.
All right, thank you. Really interesting question here from Sam Fisher, and it's not directed towards any of you specifically, but I think I'll direct it towards Raquel. He says, loved how clear this was of the people using community level data and for the people communicated back to the community. But can we hear more about how this is by the people, community's decision-making role in how data is used, how decisions are made, and so on? Because I know you talked a little bit about the role of community engagement and how that fits in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first we started with, which I think is very important in the steering committee structure when we worked with the reinvestment fund to come to a decision on the data points. The steering committee is made up of local community folks. So for instance, each of the council members appointed someone to the steering committee. Staff appointed other organizations that we knew were going to be impacted in some way or another and have some expertise to offer in the data process. So we, for example, included all of the representatives of the community housing development organizations. So they were part of actually building the MDA model. And that includes not just deciding on the data points, but also being part of the field verifications. So if they saw a rough draft of the model and they said, I'm not sure that this is really reflective of the market conditions in this area, I know some developments, that meant they would have the option to go out with the reinvestment fund team to do field verifications. They actually drove through the neighborhoods to make sure that the model reflected reality. And then as we went through the community engagement process, people were self-selecting. So the way that the town hall meetings go, you have the option to register. So we buy a list of all the registered voters, and we send them a notice that says, the city's going to be considering this policy. If you would like to continue to be informed on this, please, select this, either via telephone callback or email this number, this email, or text this number. And so we found that the vast majority of people self-selected to register to continue to be informed and continue to be engaged. But the key stakeholders, so we had a list of the folks, the community folks that were involved in the process, like the nonprofit developers, the real estate council, the industry experts, the lenders that were participating in the programs, the minority contractors organizations. Those folks, they were pretty much continually responding to all of the information and giving feedback. There were a lot of community advocates that participated in the process. Like I said, they submitted their recommendations. And if it was something, for example, that we could support, and there were lots of recommendations that we took. For example, the idea of a neighborhood empowerment zone, that came from the community itself. They also requested that there be an effort by the city to pursue homestead preservation districts. Well, that requires a legislative change, but the staff recommended that we establish a housing policy task force that would work with city staff to prepare a legislative agenda to pursue that. So definitely a whole lot of community engagement, and they needed to be empowered in that process to make their recommendations. Now, there were some recommendations that we just simply could not recommend. So we did receive recommendations that said you should only be providing assistance to people below 30% of AMI. And that's where I talked about earlier. Well, the federal funds that cities receive are for low to moderate income families. That has a federal definition. People who are at 30% of AMI are actually defined as extremely low income, and that has a specific source of funding. That funding goes to housing authorities. So while the city can use some of its non-federal funds to support that, and in fact, the city did set some production goals to serve people at 30% of AMI, it was just not going to be feasible for the city to focus only on 30% of AMI households. So anytime a community advocate group made a recommendation like that, well, we would explain why we couldn't support it.
All right, thank you. And there's a lot more really good questions, but we're at this point out of time. So we will send on the questions to our panelists and see if they might be able to answer. But I want to give a really big thanks to Raquel, Bryce, and Steve, and all of you who listened and sent in your questions. This webinar will be available online on our Mapchats webinars webpage, and we'll, as I said earlier, we'll send you all a video link and the presentation slides for you to look at. And for anyone who wants to stick around, I just want to give you a little mention of how PolicyMap can help as a data tool for efficient government. PolicyMap is an online data and mapping tool for accessing and sharing information about communities across the US. Federal government agencies and those working at the local level can make use of place-based data to make better informed decisions without needing to learn complicated GIS software or hunt down data from multiple sources. The PolicyMap platform allows different divisions within a single government entity to share maps of their data for better coordination and effectiveness. Here, for example, is a map of Philadelphia with commercial corridors as blue outlines and recent business and restaurant licenses as points. An economic development analyst assessing retail corridors can see what kinds of businesses have opened in key corridors. If, say, a corridor has too many new gas stations and garages, that could be flagged, and steps could be taken to encourage development of stores and restaurants to balance out the commercial mix. PolicyMap empowers non-data experts to use their own data alongside ours without hindering your busy GIS staff. Data on PolicyMap comes from dozens of public authoritative sources like the Census, BLS, CDC, HUD, and the IRS, and exclusive proprietary sources like Zillow, Great Schools, and our own expert data analysts. So for more information, check out our website or get in touch. You can download our recent white paper on data and effective government at the website listed here, policymap.com/issues/goodgovernment. And please send us any feedback about this webinar or suggestions for other topics you might want to see in future webinars. Check back on our webpage for details on upcoming webinars, and check out our blog for other insights into data and mapping. Thanks everyone for joining.